March 29, 1911, Washington, D.C. Inside the offices of the United States Army, a decision was being made that would quietly shape American military history for the next 74 years. The Army was adopting a new handgun. It was not futuristic. It did not fire a revolutionary cartridge. It did not look like the weapon that would define an entire century of American warfare. In fact, compared with some of the expensive and complicated weapons already being tested around the world, it looked almost ordinary. But the Army had just adopted the M1911. And nobody in that room could have known what was about to happen. Because this pistol would survive the trenches of France. It would survive the beaches of Normandy. It would survive the islands of the Pacific. It would appear in the frozen mountains of Korea. It would ride into the jungles of Vietnam. And when newer pistols finally replaced it as America's standard sidearm, the M1911 still refused to disappear. It had been designed for one war. It ended up serving through generations of wars. And at one point, the government could acquire one for roughly $15. That sounds almost absurd today. But the real mystery isn't why America bought it. The real mystery is this. How did a pistol designed before World War I remain relevant long after the soldiers who first carried it were gone? The answer begins with a problem the U.S. Army had already experienced the hard way. At the beginning of the 20th century, the American military was not satisfied with its standard handgun. The Army had spent years using revolvers. They were familiar. They were dependable. But warfare was changing. Semi-automatic pistols were becoming increasingly practical. European armies were experimenting with new designs. American soldiers needed a weapon that could deliver more firepower in a compact package. The Army began searching for something better. And one American firearms designer was about to give them exactly what they wanted. His name was John Moses Browning. Browning had already established himself as one of the most important firearms designers in American history. But the handgun he developed for Colt would become his masterpiece. The pistol eventually known as the M1911. Browning's challenge was deceptively simple. Create a semi-automatic pistol powerful enough for military use, yet reliable enough to survive the abuse of soldiers. That meant solving several problems simultaneously. The weapon had to be compact. It had to be durable. It had to be simple enough for soldiers to understand. It had to function under terrible battlefield conditions. And most importantly, it had to fire the Army's powerful .45 caliber cartridge. That last requirement mattered. The Army had already become skeptical of smaller handgun cartridges. Experiences during conflicts such as the Philippine-American War had contributed to the belief that a more powerful sidearm was necessary. The new pistol therefore had a difficult assignment. It couldn't merely be convenient. It had to hit hard. Browning's design used a short recoil operating system. That phrase sounds technical, but the basic idea was elegant. The barrel and slide initially moved together under recoil. Then the barrel unlocked from the slide. The slide continued backward, extracting and ejecting the spent cartridge. A new round was then chambered as the slide returned forward. It was mechanical choreography, and when properly engineered, it happened in fractions of a second. The result was a pistol that combined a powerful cartridge with a relatively compact and controllable design. But there was another reason the pistol would become legendary. It was built with an unusual degree of mechanical simplicity. Soldiers didn't need to understand every engineering principle inside the weapon. They simply needed to know how to operate and maintain it. That distinction would become extremely important, because the battlefield is not a laboratory. On April 24, 1911, the Army placed its first major order with Colt, more than 31,000 pistols. By early 1917, More than 100,000 had been manufactured by Colt and Springfield Armory under license. The pistol was beginning its military career. But the real test was coming. Europe was already at war, and America was moving steadily toward involvement. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the Army suddenly needed weapons on a completely different scale. The old production numbers were no longer enough. The government ordered hundreds of thousands more. Manufacturers were brought into the effort. Production expanded. And the M1911 was about to leave American factories and enter the most brutal environment imaginable. The trenches of France. Imagine the conditions. Mud, rain, cold, sandbags, artillery explosions, weapons constantly exposed to dirt and moisture. A soldier could spend hours carrying his pistol through mud and then suddenly need it during a close-range fight. There was no clean shooting range, no controlled environment, no guarantee that the weapon would receive perfect maintenance. A military handgun had to survive reality. And reality was ugly. The M1911 did. American troops crossed the Atlantic in enormous numbers. Among them were officers, machine gun crews, artillerymen, cavalrymen, and other personnel who were issued the pistol for personal defense. The weapon wasn't intended to replace the rifle. It had a different purpose. It was the weapon a soldier carried when a rifle was inconvenient, unavailable, or simply too large. That distinction would eventually make the M1911 extraordinarily versatile. A tank crewman could carry one. An officer could carry one. A pilot could carry one. A machine gunner could carry one. A soldier operating a heavy weapon could carry one. It occupied a relatively small space, yet offered immediate defensive capability. By the end of World War I, the M1911 had already demonstrated something important. It wasn't perfect. No weapon was. But it was durable. It was powerful. And soldiers trusted it. That last quality cannot be measured easily in a factory report. A weapon becomes truly successful when soldiers believe it will work when everything else is going wrong. The M1911 was beginning to earn that reputation. Then the war ended. For many weapons, peace would have meant the end of their story. For the M1911, it was only the beginning. The pistol remained in American service during the interwar years. Then, in 1939, Europe exploded into another world war. Within 2 years, the United States was fighting again. The Army needed millions of weapons. The M1911 was already proven. But the country had learned another lesson from the First World War. A weapon could be excellent and still be too expensive or time-consuming to manufacture in enormous quantities. So the M1911 evolved. The improved version became the M1911A1. The changes were relatively modest. The rear sight was altered. The trigger was shortened. The grip was modified. The frame received subtle changes intended to make the pistol more comfortable for a wider range of users. Nothing about it looked revolutionary. And that was the point. The Army wasn't replacing a successful design. It was refining one. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered the Second World War. Within months, the M1911A1 would be everywhere. In Europe. In North Africa. In the Pacific. Inside tanks. On landing craft. In bombers. With Marines moving through jungle. With soldiers crossing beaches. With officers directing attacks. With wounded men trying to survive. The same basic pistol adopted in 1911 was now being carried by an entirely new generation of Americans. And this time, there would be millions of them. The M1911's wartime production became enormous. Several American companies joined the manufacturing effort. Colt, Remington Rand, Ithaca, Union Switch and Signal. Even the Singer Company produced a small number of exceptionally scarce examples. The pistol had transformed from one company's design into a national industrial product. During World War II, roughly 1.9 million M1911A1 pistols were produced. And the cost? Around $15 per pistol in wartime production estimates. A cheap weapon by military standards. But cheap did not mean disposable. Quite the opposite. The M1911 was becoming something far more valuable. A weapon that soldiers could trust. And after the war, that trust would follow it into the next battlefield. Because America had no intention of retiring the old pistol, not yet. And soon, it would face its coldest test. Korea, June 25, 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The Korean War had begun. For American soldiers arriving on the peninsula, this was a very different war from the one their fathers had fought only 5 years earlier. The landscape was brutal. Mountains dominated the country. Winters were vicious. Temperatures could fall far below zero. Equipment froze. Vehicles struggled. Men fought exhausted and often without adequate shelter. And among the equipment carried into this new conflict was an old American weapon. The M1911A1. It was nearly 40 years old. Some soldiers carrying it had not even been born when the pistol was adopted. Yet there it was, still in American hands, still serving. The Korean Winter became one of the greatest tests of military equipment in the post-war era. Metal became painfully cold to the touch. Lubricants could become problematic. Batteries failed. Vehicles struggled to start. Men wrapped themselves in every layer of clothing they could find. But the M1911 continued to perform the role it had performed for decades. It was a backup, a sidearm, a weapon for close-range emergencies. And for tank crews, officers, artillerymen, and others who couldn't conveniently carry a full-sized rifle at all times, that mattered. The pistol's longevity was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a pattern. Then came another war. Vietnam. The environment changed again. The Korean mountains were replaced by jungle, heat, humidity, mud, monsoon rain, dense vegetation. The enemy could be almost impossible to see. American forces relied on increasingly modern weapons. The M16 was entering service. Helicopters transformed mobility. Night vision equipment became increasingly important. Jet aircraft dominated the skies. The battlefield looked like the future. And yet, the M1911 remained. A pistol born before the First World War was still sitting in American holsters during the age of helicopters and jet fighters. That contrast tells you almost everything about its reputation. But why? Why didn't the military simply replace it? After all, technology had advanced enormously. New pistols were being designed. New materials were appearing. New manufacturing methods were available. The answer was partly institutional. The M1911 had an enormous existing infrastructure. Millions had already been manufactured. Armories knew how to maintain them. Soldiers knew how to use them. Spare parts existed. Training systems existed. And perhaps most importantly, the pistol worked. Replacing a weapon that works is harder than designing a new one. A new weapon has to be significantly better, not merely different. The M1911 also had another advantage. It had become deeply embedded in American military culture. Generations of soldiers had carried it. Veterans returned home with stories about it. Movies and photographs turned its distinctive silhouette into one of the visual symbols of the American soldier. It wasn't simply a piece of equipment anymore. It was an icon, but military institutions don't keep weapons forever because they are sentimental. Eventually, something has to replace them. And by the 1970s and early 1980s, the M1911 was finally approaching that moment. The military wanted a modern service pistol. The NATO alliance had increasingly standardized around the 9mm cartridge. America needed greater magazine capacity and a more modern design. The M1911 carried 7 rounds in its standard magazine. Newer pistols could carry considerably more. The world had changed. The military's requirements had changed. And after more than 7 decades, the M1911 was finally going to retire as America's standard sidearm. In 1985, the United States military adopted the Beretta M9 as its standard service pistol. The old .45 was officially being replaced. After 74 years, the M1911 had lost its position, but it had not disappeared. Not even close. This is where the story becomes more interesting. Because retired is not the same thing as gone. M1911 pistols continued serving in specialized roles. Some military units retained them. Some special operations personnel preferred them. The Marine Corps continued using M1911-derived pistols for certain applications. And outside the military, the design became enormously influential. American manufacturers continued producing commercial versions. Competitive shooters adopted customized variants. Law enforcement personnel carried them. Collectors preserved wartime examples. And civilians continued buying them. The pistol had escaped the military system that created it. It had become part of American culture. That was perhaps the greatest victory of John Browning's design. The military could replace the M1911. But the M1911 didn't need the military anymore. It had already become an institution. Its basic operating principles were copied, modified, refined, and reinterpreted in countless later handgun designs. Its grip angle became familiar. Its manual safety became iconic. Its single-action trigger became famous among shooting enthusiasts. Its .45 ACP chambering became inseparable from the image of the classic American service pistol. Even people who had never served in the military knew what a 1911 looked like. That is unusual. Most military equipment disappears from public consciousness once it becomes obsolete. The M1911 became more famous after retirement. And then came something even stranger. The pistol's age became part of its appeal. A firearm from 1918 wasn't merely old. It was historical. It might have crossed the Atlantic during World War I. It might have been issued again during World War II. It might have been carried in Korea. It might have passed through an American armory multiple times. Some examples accumulated decades of military service. A weapon designed in the age of horses and trenches could eventually end up in the hands of someone living in the age of computers. That is an extraordinary lifespan for any machine. Consider the timeline. The M1911 was adopted before the sinking of the Titanic, before commercial radio became commonplace, before the first American military airplane crossed the Atlantic, before World War I had even entered its final year. Yet American soldiers were still carrying variants of that same design after the Vietnam era. The pistol had survived the invention of radar. jet engines, nuclear weapons, helicopters, intercontinental missiles, spaceflight, and generations of entirely new firearms. Most weapons become obsolete when technology changes. The M1911 repeatedly adapted. But there was another reason for its survival. Simplicity. The M1911 was not a computer. It didn't need electronics. It didn't need batteries. It didn't require sophisticated optics. It was a mechanical machine. Steel, springs, pins, a barrel, a slide, a magazine, and a remarkably clever system designed more than a century ago. That simplicity made it understandable, repairable, maintainable, familiar, in an era increasingly dominated by complicated technology. There was something comforting about a weapon whose essential operating principles had changed very little since 1911. By the time American forces entered the conflicts of the late 20th century, the M1911 had already accomplished something few military weapons ever achieve. It had become almost impossible to separate from the history of the American soldier. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. 4 generations. One basic design. And somewhere along the way, that $15 pistol had become something far more valuable than its original price suggested. But there was still one final question. If the M1911 was no longer America's standard military sidearm, why does its story still matter? The answer isn't simply nostalgia. It's engineering. Because more than a century after its adoption, people are still building them, still modifying them, still studying them, still carrying them, still arguing about them. And that means the $15 pistol never really retired. It simply stopped wearing a uniform. There is a strange moment in military history when a weapon stops being merely a weapon. It becomes a reference point, a standard against which everything else is measured. For American handguns, the M1911 became exactly that. The pistol had entered service in 1911. By the time the United States finally replaced it as its standard sidearm in 1985, the world had changed beyond recognition. The men who first carried it had fought in trenches. Their sons had fought in World War II. Their grandsons had fought in Vietnam. And the pistol itself had survived them all. That is why the M1911's story is not really about a $15 gun. It is about why some machines refuse to become obsolete.
Later, there will be several other opportunities to apply the two-handed grip in the prone and kneeling positions. A burst of 2 shots assures at least 1 hit.